This video was created for students who are struggling with analyzing the Sandra's Choice case study for their essay in Module 109. In that essay, you're asked to look at the behavior of 5 different professions: doctors, teachers, social workers, lawyers, and the public trustee, and to determine whether or not they've behaved in a way that's ethical. Some students struggle with that process, so here I'm about to go through 4 different case studies looked at through the lens of a different profession, not one of the 5 that's in the essay, and that profession is nursing. So even though the principles of nursing aren't going to be identical to those in your essay questions, the mechanism here will be the same. What I want you to make sure you do as you work through that process, and what I'll be modeling here, is that you understand these key ideas. First, whatever profession you are considering, you'll need to go and look up their specific principles, and you'll need to make sure that you take the time to carefully understand those principles. Make sure that you're looking at principles, not things like personal virtues. The language you'll see when you go and look at the specific resources are things like principle, standard, ethic, or commitment. Those are the words that we're interested in. Now you'll see that a lot of those principles are very similar to the ones we identified in community support work, but you cannot just simply make the assumption that the community support work principles can be immediately transferred over to the field of work or profession that you are considering. So you need to take a moment to look through those principles, and you need to make sure that you're going to the sources that I've identified for you, because there are lots of sources out there and only some of them are actually good, reliable Canadian sources. Second, you'll need to make sure that you go through this exercise in a deliberate and analytical way. It's difficult at first sometimes to set aside our emotions, both our emotions in terms of feeling nervous, as well as our emotions in terms of feeling a strong repulsion or compassion for people that has us want to sort of jump to conclusions too quickly. So it's important, and I'll model in this video, that you go through things in almost a checklist or step-by-step format. Avoid assumptions. If there isn't something talked about in the article, you'll need to assume that nothing bad has happened. This is just like a person being accused of a crime. Unless there's evidence proving or determining that somebody is guilty, we have the presumption of innocence, and that applies here as well. So the case doesn't always give us a lot of information. Sandra's Choice doesn't always give us a lot of information until we see something in it that points out that an individual has behaved unethically. We should start with the assumption that they have behaved ethically. So what we're going to do then is look for evidence. And there are 2 types of evidence that we'll look for predominantly. One of them is the one that students are usually good at, and that is evidence that somebody did something specifically wrong, unethical activity. For example, seeing somebody smack a client would be an example of something that is clearly unethical, a don't do type of scenario. Students are usually really good at seeing those. However, the other thing we're looking for is activity that should have happened but didn't. Evidence that people did not meet the standards. So for example, if a person is expected to report on somebody's progress and doesn't do that, that is considered just as unethical as if they lied in a report. Now, be careful not to look at every mistake as evidence that something unethical was happening. Just because somebody made a mistake once doesn't mean there was a pattern of unethical behavior. So it's important to look and see whether something violates the principles at that level. Evidence can be found in 2 distinct ways. Students often expect to see the story specifically say that a person was observed doing the wrong thing or observed not doing the right thing. And that is one of the ways that you'll see evidence. But there's another one that students often overlook, and that is that the outcome can tell us whether something happened or didn't happen. And you'll see examples of that in the scenarios I'll go through here. There's a saying, the proof is in the pudding. If you can tell by looking at the outcome that something which should have happened didn't, then that's evidence. And remember that if you go through that analytical process and find out that the person has done everything, at least to the minimum level, then you have to conclude that they're ethical. Don't look for evidence that a person was exceptional at their job. That's not the purpose of this assignment. Being ethical is not the same as being excellent. So a person can have done a fairly minimal amount of things and still have been ethical, even though they might not have done things to the level of practice you would have liked to see. So let's get started. These are the principles we're going to apply, and they come from the Canadian Nurses Association. So if I had a nurse in the Sandra's Choice article, I would expect you to do what I did, to go to this website, find these principles, and even though I haven't cited all of the sub-principles beneath them, I went and took the time to make sure I carefully understood exactly what each principle meant and didn't assume things. It's really important that you do this. Keep in mind that this assignment is worth 35%. At this point in the course, nothing else you've done has had that level of weight. And so it shows you I expect you to be careful and thorough and to do your research. We're going to be going through this list in every single one of our 4 scenarios so that you can see how we use this analytical process. Let's get started. So here's our first fictitious case. Marsha is a patient from an ethnic minority. She has been brought to the hospital by paramedics with apparent alcohol poisoning. Nurse White meets her at the ER door and begins a medical assessment right away. While doing that assessment, Nurse White loudly exclaims, "Marsha, I can't believe you're back here again. You are such a waste of a human being. Why don't you think about your children?" Nurse White's medical examination finds that Marsha's vital signs show that she is in danger. So Nurse White immediately refers Marsha to a doctor, and that doctor is able to detoxify Marsha, and that saves Marsha's life. Nurse White also contacts the social worker that works in the hospital with 2 intentions. She wants to see if there can be a treatment program found for Marsha, and she wants somebody to check on the welfare of Marsha's children. Let's do an analysis of whether this nurse was ethical or not. So here are those principles again. Well, the very first principle says that the nurse has to be safe, compassionate, and competent. It also says ethical, but a curious thing about the nursing principles is that we wouldn't know whether they've been ethical, which is the very question in this assignment, until we go through all 7 principles. So you'll notice I've left that one blank in every one of these 4 cases. But Nurse White's behavior was safe, and in fact, not only was it competent, but it could be easy to see that it actually saved the client's life, Marsha's life. However, it wasn't compassionate. If you go and look more deeply at the principles, you can see that the idea of humiliating a person or talking to a person in a way that wouldn't build trust clearly violates what the Nursing Association means by this principle. By the way, let's pause for a second before we go into the next one. Now that we've found one area where there's a red check mark or a red X, we can say that she has not been ethical. We're going to continue looking at the other principles, and I want you to do the same thing. But we already know that this nurse has at least one box that she didn't check. So we'll conclude that she wasn't ethical. However, she did promote the health and well-being of Marsha. She not only promoted the health in the moment, but she also tried to bring in a recovery service, and even thought about the well-being of her children. That's a green one. Now, in the scenario, there was nothing about asking Marsha for decision-making. She didn't need to in those circumstances. The social worker will go and ask Marsha whether she wants any help. And the law stipulates that that the children should be checked upon. So there's really nothing here that Nurse White needed to do. However, we can say that she didn't do anything wrong in that area, so we leave it as a green check mark. Clearly, she treated this lady without dignity. She said things that were humiliating and judgmental, and if you look at the next concept of privacy and confidentiality, she also revealed publicly this information. She used her name, she indicated that she'd been in the ER before, she indicated that she had children, she did that where others could have heard. So not only did she speak to Marsha in a way that was undignified, but she clearly dealt with some private information in a way that didn't respect her privacy. We have no real evidence that she needed to do anything here to promote justice or not promote justice, not a terribly important concept in this case, so it just simply gets checked off. It's considered to have not been violated. And there's no evidence that the nurse did or did not record what she did. There's no evidence that the nurse denied it later on. In fact, one thing you can say is that by saying all of this stuff publicly, it's pretty obvious that she was doing it openly. So even though we may not like what she did, we can't accuse her of being dishonest or hiding things. At the end of the day, though, we have found 3 different things that she didn't do, and we conclude that she wasn't ethical. Now you'll notice one thing, I hope, which is that the very first point in the case about Marsha was that she was from an ethnic minority. You might have expected that to come up in my analysis, but I put that in there on purpose. Even though I might want to assume that the way Nurse White treated Marsha had something to do with racism, there's nothing in the case that says that or suggests that. So that piece of information ended up being not terribly pertinent, and I needed to make sure I didn't express an assumption. Let's do a second case. This is the case of Sheldon. Sheldon's an elderly man who comes to the hospital via ambulance with signs of a stroke. Sheldon is wearing an expensive watch, and he sees Nurse Red take it and put it in her pocket while he's receiving care. Sheldon receives good care from the medical staff, and in fact, he fully recovers from his stroke. The nurse would have been part of that medical staff. Later on, Sheldon files a complaint against Nurse Red, and perhaps surprisingly, she admits that she took his watch. Did she violate her principles, thereby being unethical? Well, she did things that were safe, and she was clearly competent because Sheldon survived. But if you look in detail at the nurse's principles, they talk about the importance of doing things that engender trust. Stealing somebody's watch in front of them would have clearly communicated, you shouldn't trust me. Would have been a troubling thing for somebody in the situation that Sheldon was in. So we can immediately describe that as violated. And once again, even if we didn't go through the other 6 principles, we know that this nurse has not achieved the ethical standard. Let's talk about the next one still, though, and I want you to do this in your essay. Yes, she promoted health and well-being. Sheldon recovered. Yes, there's no evidence that he was asked to make any decisions, so we have to assume this was an upheld principle. Honoring dignity, you might think that in this particular case, her behavior constitutes a violation of dignity. And if we were talking about CSWs, we would conclude that. But that's not where the nurses put this concept. And this is one of the reasons why I chose nurses and why I want you to go back and understand their principles clearly. They don't consider this sort of dishonest behavior to be in this category. You'll see where they put it later on. Maintaining privacy and confidentiality. For us as CSWs, we consider the ownership of somebody's possessions to be in this category. Nurses don't. So this gets a green check mark. There's no evidence that she told other people this man's private information, which is really what nurses mean by this principle. There's absolutely no evidence here that this was a situation that called for advocating for more justice or equity, so it just doesn't apply, and it again gets the green check mark. But even though Nurse Red later on admitted to taking the watch, her act of stealing the watch was dishonest. And in the nursing code, that dishonest behavior falls under this principle. So she violated the principle of accountability by acting unethically. She did something she should not have done. She acted in a way that involved theft. Later on, she was ethical when she said that she would accept blame for it. She admitted she'd done it. But that does not change the fact that she'd already done something unethical. So we'd have to conclude that Nurse Red was not ethical. Case number 3, Penelope is a 53-year-old woman who has been diagnosed with amyotrophic lateral sclerosis, or ALS, and that's a debilitating neurological condition. Now, unlike our other people, Penelope lives in her own home, and she is served by a home health nurse. Penelope drowned in her own bathtub while Nurse Purple was on shift. You can see this is a very short case, and you can see we have absolutely no description of what Nurse Purple was doing when all of this happened. Can we still draw a conclusion? Yes, we can, and this case is very relevant to the sorts of scenarios that you'll encounter for some of the professions in the Sandra's Choice article, because they don't give a lot of information about some of those professions. You might be inclined to immediately say, well, that means nothing bad happened, or that something bad happened. I want you to instead use the same tools I use here. So let's go through the principles once again. Right off the bat, we show that this could not have been safe or competent. How do we know? The proof is in the pudding. If you're a home health nurse and somebody drowns in their bathtub, we can tell from the outcome that you must not have been safe and you must not have done your job adequately or competently. That's all we need to know. That should never happen. A person drowning in their bathtub is literally an impossibility if a nurse is doing their job correctly. And we don't have any evidence about the compassion level of Nurse Purple in this scenario, and that's going to cause us to leave that one checked as green. Even though this might seem automatic, we might want to assume that there wasn't compassion. We just don't have enough evidence. We don't need a lot of evidence. As soon as one of these characteristics is red, we know that unethical behavior has occurred. We also can say there was not evidence of promoting health and well-being, and that's a standard we expect. If this person had not drowned in their bathtub, we wouldn't have enough evidence that they were getting everything they needed. But the fact that they drowned in their bathtub is enough evidence that they weren't getting enough supervision. Don't have any idea about whether or not they were involved in decision making. That gets a green check. Same thing with dignity. Don't know whether or not this Nurse Purple was nice and dignified with Penelope on other days. Not relevant, no evidence to suggest it wasn't upheld, so it continues to be green. Same thing with privacy and confidentiality, simply not dealt with, gets a green. Same thing with promoting justice, gets a green. And we don't know. The story does not tell us whether Penelope admitted that she did something wrong. We simply don't know. And until that, we are going to give it the green check mark. But that doesn't matter because we have enough evidence at the top of our screen to show that she was not ethical. And that was not by us observing what she did, by looking at outcomes. That's all the evidence we needed. Let's look at one more case. The case of Ricardo. Ricardo came into the ER. He was an ambulatory or walk-in patient with a migraine headache. Nurse Green was working at the front desk, which is called the triage desk. That person's job is to determine how important it is that you receive care and to put you into an order of priority. The ER was very busy at that time due to a major car accident in the area. Nurse Green was in a hurry, so she was very direct with Ricardo. She said, and this is a quote, "Listen, I'm going to be direct with you. This ER is crammed with people who have life or death situations right now, so it's unlikely a doctor will be able to see you for quite some time. You're in a lot of pain, but you're not going to die. I would either suggest that you go home or that you try the urgent care clinic down the road in the morning." Ricardo went home. We might even say that Ricardo went home begrudgingly, and he had a restless night. He wasn't able to sleep very well. The next morning, he phoned his local doctor, and the doctor took his information over the phone and sent a renewed prescription for painkillers to the local pharmacy so that Ricardo could go get them. Let's go through our principles. Was the nurse safe, compassionate, competent, and ethical? Well, we can't conclude ethical yet, but we can talk about the first three. Yes, she was 100% safe. What she did, and she even said it, was not a matter of life and death. You might argue that she could have been more gentle with him, but it was clear that she was giving him some advice based on what she felt was going to be most honest and helpful. And she was competent. She didn't try to put him at the top of the line ahead of people who had life or death issues. So, green check mark. What she did promoted his health and well-being. In fact, you could argue that having him sit all night long in an ER with bright lights and loud noises would only have been harder for him. So she did something, even if it might have been a different way than you, she did something that was clearly designed to promote his health and well-being. And she gave him information that would allow him to make a decision. She gave him some options and gave him a reasoning so that he could do that. She honored his dignity. Now, you might wish that she had been a little bit more polite with him, but she didn't yell at him or call him a name or humiliate him. She was just direct. And the codes of conduct, whether it's for nurses or anybody, cannot get into a level of how polite we are with people. Instead, we have to look at a reasonable level. So if this nurse had said something racist or had sworn or yelled at this person, we could argue that those were not reasonable ways of managing this scenario. But there's none of that here. There's no evidence that she did something that violated privacy and confidentiality. She had a conversation with him at the triage desk, which is the right place. And she does not have anything in the scenario about promoting justice. It just simply doesn't come up. So it again gets the green check mark. And again, there's no evidence that she tried to hide this or didn't record it or didn't admit to it when asked later on. Simply doesn't get dealt with in the scenario. So we have to give it a green check mark. Looking at our screen, we can see there's absolutely nothing in red. No bad choices, no lack of good choices. So we have to conclude that the nurse was ethical in this situation. All right, so hopefully that gives you a chance to look at how you can go through the process with those 5 different groups of professionals in the essay. Here are the key ideas. Once again, make sure you go back and look up the proper principles for each of those 5 professions. Take the time to truly understand them and make sure that you can apply them to the case. Then go through, as you've seen me do 4 times here, and apply them in an analytical way. You need to be able to say, if you've described something as violated, why it was violated. You need to say that the person did the wrong thing and give an example of it, or that they didn't do enough of the right thing and give an example or evidence from the Sandra's Choice article. Don't jump to assumptions or let your emotions do the work. This is a mental process, not an emotional one. It involves looking for evidence. And remember, we're looking for 2 types of evidence. Evidence that something that should not have been done was done, something that is misconduct, like violence or stealing. And look for evidence that something that should have been done was done. If there's evidence that somebody did not do enough, that's just as unethical. That's failing to meet a standard. And you'll notice that some of the professions express themselves almost entirely as standards. Remember not to look at normal human error as unethical conduct. See if something truly violates the principle. Look for evidence of that. Evidence can be something that is described in the article. We saw that it was done wrong. Or it can be evidence that's comes through in the outcome. Proof in the pudding. If all the principles are okay, then describe that professional as being ethical. Don't look for evidence that the professional was excellent in the work, just that nothing was done according or in a violation of their principles. All right. Well, this is a long video, but I hope it's a helpful one for you. Make sure that you're going through it carefully, and feel free to get feedback from me after you've looked at one of the professions instead of waiting till all 5. Okay? Good luck.